Yeah, I told you there'd be war today, right?
Yeah.
If you got an outline, you can follow along with me. It's kind of simple today. We've been talking about worship, and I sent out an email, and I was encouraging you to be here because today is about a war. And whether or not, I mean, there's a lot of wars going on. There's wars going on in our world. There's wars going on in our nation. Wars over whether or not, as Daryl was sharing a couple of weeks ago, wars on whether or not a judge can keep the Ten Commandments in his courtroom. And, you know, in the Supreme Court, as in Alabama. Just crazy things going on. And there's also the spiritual war that we face each and every day. But none of these things are what I'm talking about today. This is something different. This is the war for your worship. That there's actually a war going on because there's a war over you. Now that should make us feel pretty important, right? That there's this war that's been going on for eternity, and it's all about who I will worship. Am I going to worship God, who made me? Am I going to worship Satan, who's trying to steal me away? Am I going to worship myself because I think I'm all that? Which I'm not. Anybody knows that I'm not. There's a war for our worship. And this is going into our consumed series. So let's jump ahead a little bit. I want to get into these passages of Scripture as we start. Again, this is our central thought. I shared this last week, that worship will either define who we are, or we will spend all of our time trying to define what worship is. That's a big danger. That's a big... you've heard playing with fire. What are you looking for, April? Oh, it's around here somewhere. It's all right. If it rings, nobody answer it. It's all right. Although she doesn't have her voicemail set up. So worship will either define who we are, or we will spend all of our time trying to define what worship is. And as, you know, just give you a little insight from last week, God defines what worship is. God asks us to respond to Him in worship. And so once we kind of lay the groundwork, we've got to understand that there's a war going on. So let's look at these passages of Scripture this morning. This is our foundation. Isaiah 14, 13 and 14. Notice all the I wills, even before we get in here. And I'm getting ready to ask what the context of this is. And maybe you know it, maybe you can guess. It says, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God. I will sit enthroned on the mount of assembly. I will ascend above the tops of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. Who's talking? Take a guess. There's two people fighting for our worship today. If somebody's talking here and he's saying, I want to be like God, I want to be more than God, I want to be higher than God, it's not God talking here. In fact, this is our insight a little bit into the downfall of Satan and to Lucifer. He had this aspiration that he wanted to be the most revered thing in all of creation, even more revered than God, and he has this desire. And so that is happening right now. He still wants your worship. And whether you say, and I know it's so crazy. I mean, because I remember growing up, you know, Satan worshipers, you know, growing up in the mid-'80s, you'd hear about that in church and it'd scare us all to death, you know. There's people running around in these black hoods and the pentagram, or what's that called, the upside down star in the circle? Is that a pentagram? Okay, anyway. And these sacrifices going on in the woods and you know, people getting kidnapped and all this stuff and brainwashed and the exorcisms and all that. It scared me to death. And I'm like, I'll never worship Satan in that way. He doesn't even care if we worship him in that way. As long as we're not worshiping God. He's already halfway won this war if we divert our attention away from God. So that's what he said. And he doesn't stop there. In it's Matthew. Matthew chapter 4, 8 and 9. The devil took Jesus to a very high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their splendor, all the greatness and so forth. All this I will give you. Satan's talking here. All this I will give you, he said, if you will bow down and worship me. There is a war for our worship. We're not innocent bystanders. We're not Switzerland, right, that stays neutral in all these conflicts. Is it Switzerland that's over there? We can't say, well, that's their war, or that's this going on. That's all the way over in Afghanistan. That's all the way over. It doesn't concern me. It does concern us. That's the biggest danger for us to say, well, this doesn't matter to me. When Satan's painted a target on each one of us, and his desire is to steal our worship away from God. And he'll do whatever he can to make it happen. And I will tell you this morning, he won't do that. He doesn't follow any of these, these treaties or the Geneva Convention, with what's fair and he'll play dirty. He'll use what's most cherished to you and try to use it against you. I mean, I look at my life and what would be the easiest way to get to me? That'd be through April or my family, my children. You want to tear me apart. That would be where it would start. I could probably handle a personal attack better than I could handle an attack on my family. And Satan will do whatever he has to steal your worship. Because look at it. He desperately wants it. He gave up everything to have your worship. To steal it. He's all in. He's pushed all the chips to the center of the table. He's making everything on it. So we've got to realize that there's a war for our worship. And it's been raging long before we were born. It's raging today. It's going to rage tomorrow. It's going to rage Tuesday when you go to school. It's going to rage when we go back to work. It's going to continue to rage, and we don't get a ceasefire. It will always be going on. And so I want to take you through this hopefully, and I'm just praying that God can do something big here today and just help us. Help us understand why worship is so important. It's got to be of some value, right? If there's a war going on, it's got to be important. People don't fight over things that have no value. Nations conquer other nations over land, resources, whatever, people. It's got to have some importance. So why is worship so important? Number one, we have to understand that it's important because we are worshipers. Every single person in the world is a worshiper. Even if they're not in church today, they're worshipers. Even if they don't want to acknowledge Jesus Christ as their Savior, they are a worshiper. It's part of why we were made. It's part of who we are. It's been written into our DNA. We are worshipers. Exodus 20, verses 3 through 5. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself idols. You shall not bow down to them or worship them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God. It was so important that God decided we'll have to make a rule about worship. I should be